You wake up before the sun, not because you want to. Your body has to. There is a field waiting, and it does not care how tired you are. For most of human history, this was not your life. For roughly 300,000 years, your ancestors woke up when their bodies were ready, not when a crop demanded it. Then, about 12,000 years ago, something changed, and your body has been paying for it ever since. This is the story of the agricultural transition, one of the strangest turning points in the human story. Not because people started farming, but because of what farming quietly did to the human skeleton, the human diet, and the human day. Let's start with the myth, because you have probably heard a version of it. The myth goes like this. Humans were starving, scattered, and desperate until agriculture rescued us with stability, surplus, and civilization. It is a tidy story. It is also, according to a lot of the physical evidence, mostly wrong. Bioarchaeologist Clark Spencer Larson has spent decades studying human skeletons from exactly this transition period, comparing foraging populations to early farming populations across multiple regions. His research, along with a widely cited 2011 review by Amanda Mummert and colleagues, found something consistent and a little uncomfortable. When populations shifted from foraging to farming, average height often dropped, bone density often dropped, signs of anemia, tooth decay, and infectious disease often increased. Here is what I find remarkable about this. We tend to think of farming as an upgrade. The skeletons tell a more complicated story. This is not a fringe idea. It traces back to an influential 1,984 volume edited by Mark Nathan Cohen and George Armalagos, which pulled together paleopathology data, that is, the study of disease and injury preserved in ancient skeletons, from farming transitions around the world. Across many of those case studies, the same pattern kept showing up. Tooth decay rose sharply. Once diets shifted towards starchy, sticky grains that cling to enamel far more than wild forage ever did. Enamel defects linked to childhood nutritional stress, called Harris lines, and enamel hypoplasia by researchers, appeared more often in early farming children than in foraging ones. None of this proves farming was a mistake. It proves the transition carried a real, physical cost, one still visible in the bones themselves. So why did height and health decline? Diet is the biggest suspect. A forager's diet was often surprisingly varied, pulling from dozens of wild plants, roots, nuts, and animals across the seasons. A farmer's diet increasingly narrowed around a small number of staple crops: wheat, barley, later, rice or maize, depending on the region. Fewer nutrients, less variety, and a much heavier dependence on whatever that year's harvest actually produced. Let's put you inside it. Picture the site of Abu Huraira, in what is now Syria, one of the places archaeologists have used to trace this exact shift. Excavations there, led by Andrew Moore, uncovered a settlement that existed right at the hinge point between foraging and farming, occupied for thousands of years. As that transition unfolded, skeletal remains from the site show something telling. Signs of repetitive strain in the spine and knees, the kind of wear you would expect from hours spent grinding grain by hand, day after day, season after season. Grinding grain does not sound dramatic. It was. Turning wild wheat into something edible required crushing it, over and over, with a stone tool, for hours. Multiply that by every meal, for every person, for a lifetime. Your ancestors' joints paid the bill. This labor was not shared equally, either. Bioarchaeological studies of grinding-related skeletal stress, including work drawing on collections from early farming sites in the Near East, have found this kind of wear concentrated disproportionately in female skeletons. Grinding grain appears to have fallen largely to women, hour after hour, which means the physical cost of the agricultural transition was not distributed evenly across a household. It was distributed by role. That is a detail that rarely makes it into the tidy version of this story. Now, picture a settlement further along that same transition, Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, one of the largest and most studied early farming towns in the world, excavated extensively under archaeologist Ian Hodder. By around 7000 BCE, thousands of people were living there, packed into mud brick houses built wall to wall, with no streets between them. People entered their homes through holes in the roof, Living that close together changed everything. Waste piled up. Livestock lived nearby. Disease had a much easier time moving from person to person than it ever did in small, mobile foraging bands. Skeletal analysis from Sotelhoyuk shows evidence of tuberculosis and other infections that were rare or absent in earlier foraging populations. Density, it turns out, is good for crops and surprisingly bad for immune systems. There is a related piece of this that epidemiologists and archaeologists have connected for decades. Living in close, sustained contact with penned livestock, something foraging life rarely involved, created new opportunities for diseases to jump from animals to humans. Researchers studying the origins of diseases like measles and tuberculosis have traced plausible animal origins tied to cattle domestication, though the exact timing and species involved for any single disease is still actively debated rather than settled. What is not seriously disputed is the broader pattern. Dense, sedentary, animal-adjacent living created disease pressures foraging bands simply did not face at the same scale. Here is where the story gets stranger, and where the evidence actually gets debated. You would assume farming came first, and that big communal structures, temples, and religious life came later, once agriculture had freed people up to build them. Göbekli Tepe complicates that timeline. Discovered and excavated by archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Göbekli Tepe is a massive complex of carved stone pillars in what is now southeastern Turkey, dated to around 9,600 BCE. That is before clear evidence of full-scale farming in the region. Hunter-gatherers, not farmers, appear to have built it. Some researchers argue this suggests that large-scale ritual gathering may have helped drive the shift toward agriculture, rather than the other way around, as communities needed a reliable food surplus to feed the people who gathered there. Other researchers are more cautious about how much weight Göbekli Tepe alone can carry in that argument. The evidence is genuinely still being worked out, and any version of this story that sounds too neat is probably oversimplifying it. So let's reconstruct a day, using what the evidence actually supports. You wake in a mud brick house at Çatalhöyük, smoke still hanging near the roof hole from last night's fire. You climb a ladder up and out, onto the rooftop, because that is how you move through the settlement, over the tops of houses, instead of through streets. Below you, someone is already grinding grain against a stone quern, the same repetitive motion that will eventually show up as wear on their vertebrae. Sheep and goats are penned nearby, close enough that their waste and yours share the same crowded air. You eat mostly bread and porridge today, probably also yesterday, probably also tomorrow. This is not a story about laziness or ignorance. Political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott, in his research on the earliest agricultural states, makes the case that people did not stumble into farming because they were too foolish to keep foraging. Foraging, in many environments, actually required more ecological knowledge and offered more dietary security, not less. Scott's argument is that early farming often took hold gradually, sometimes even reluctantly, and it stuck for reasons that had less to do with individual well-being and more to do with population growth and the political and military advantages a large, settled, taxable population eventually offered to those in power. That is the counterintuitive twist. Farming was not obviously good for the individual person doing it. The evidence suggests it was frequently worse for them, physically. What it was good for was scale. A field can feed more people per acre than foraging land can, even if each of those people ends up shorter, more anemic, and more exposed to disease than their foraging ancestors were. Population grew because of farming's ability to support larger numbers, even while individual health metrics moved in the opposite direction. This is exactly the argument that made science writer and physiologist Jared Diamond famously call agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race in a widely read 1,987 essay. That framing is deliberately provocative, and most researchers today treat it as a useful starting point for debate rather than a settled conclusion. Farming clearly was not a mistake in any simple sense. It eventually supported a level of human population that foraging never could have. But Diamond's essay pushed the field to stop assuming farming was automatically good for the people living through it. And that pressure is part of why the skeletal evidence we just walked through was taken so seriously. There is also a demographic piece worth naming. Some researchers argue that settled farming life shortened the natural gap between births, since mothers were no longer carrying young children across long foraging distances and weaning schedules could shift. A shorter birth interval means more children born per woman over a lifetime, even if a higher proportion of those children face nutritional stress in early life. Population size, in other words, could climb even while individual health metrics slipped because the two are not the same measurement. This is one of the more debated pieces of the puzzle, and not every researcher agrees on how large this effect actually was. Not every region shows the same decline to the same degree, and the picture in each area of the world where farming independently developed, from the Fertile Crescent to Mesoamerica to China, has its own local nuances that bioarchaeologists are still comparing. What is consistent across most of the studied regions is the general direction of the trend, even if the size of the effect varies. There is also a trade-off worth naming honestly, because farming was not purely a story of decline. Grain could be stored. Surplus meant that a bad season did not automatically mean starvation, at least not right away. Settled life allowed for larger families, more complex tools, specialized labor, and eventually, the dense populations that later made cities, writing, and large-scale cooperation possible. None of this happened without real, measurable cost to the bodies of the people living through the transition. Both things are true at once. Here is the modern mirror, and I want to be careful with it, because the parallel is not perfect. You do not grind your own grain by hand for hours a day, but you might sit at a desk for hours a day, in a posture your joints did not evolve for, eating a diet built around a small number of processed staples, rather than a wide seasonal variety. You live in dense proximity to more people than any forager ever did, which comes with its own advantages and its own disease exposure. None of this is a health recommendation. It is simply a pattern that has been repeating, in different forms, since Abu Huraira. Think about how much of your own week is shaped by a small set of staple foods, a fixed schedule, and repetitive physical positions, whether that is a desk, a checkout counter, or a delivery van. None of that makes your life comparable to a Neolithic farmer's in any direct sense. Your risks are different. Your diseases are different. Your options are wildly different. But the underlying shape, a trade of bodily variety and physical range for stability, scale, and predictability, is one your species has been negotiating for 12,000 years, and arguably still is. The people at Çatalhöyük were not living in a golden age of abundance, and they were not living in constant misery either. They were living through a trade-off, one that swapped some individual physical well-being for population growth, stored surplus, and the beginnings of a way of life that eventually built everything you know today, including the device you are watching this on. You wake up before the sun, not because your body demands it, but because something you built demands it instead. 12,000 years later, that trade is still being made, just in a different field.